Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. And as Omar mentioned, some of the themes I'm going to talk about do develop the general ideas that Mark introduced, the idea that thinking about development or thinking about growth as a means of getting development makes us try to think about public policy and how to think about designing policies in order to achieve this. I think the other thing that I'll come back to repeatedly, we know very little still. I think what we know about what we can do to actually achieve development across a number of countries is very limited. What I wanted to focus on today was one specific aspect of governance that has, I think, got a lot of attention, which is the idea of corruption, the extent to which public policies, no matter which direction they're targeted in, will fail because they don't reach the intended beneficiaries. So let me start by just going through some stylized facts of the links between corruption and development, which are very often used in motivating public policy. So one of the most common ways in which corruption or misgovernance tends to be measured across the globe is through surveys. So a number of organizations, the World Bank and a number of other organizations, tend to have surveys typically of firm owners in different countries and ask them what kind of bribes do you pay, how much harassment do you face. And if you look at one of these indices, so this is from the Transparency International, one of the most striking features is a very strong correlation between being poor and having reports of higher levels of corruption. And this, I think, these surveys have been an extremely important reason why numerous policy organizations, foreign donor agencies have focused on thinking about reducing corruption as a way of increasing growth. So the first question you might ask is, there's clearly a very broad correlation just between levels of income and corruption. If you do a more careful analysis to ask what the costs of corruption are, do you see that corruption is costly? So we can see this link, but is it the case that corruption actually costs a country in terms of GDP? So there's been a growing literature that now tries to think about estimates of this. What is the cost of corruption? So I'm just going to pick up a few from countries across the world. So the first study, which was done for Uganda, traced the difference between the amount of money released by the Ministry of Education for school expenditures and the amount of money received by schools. And what it found was that in Uganda, roughly 87% of the funds disappeared between the point when they were assigned by the government and they reached the beneficiaries. In Indonesia, Ben Olken tried to get another estimate of sort of missing expenditure by digging up rural roads. So he dug up roads and used engineers to come up with estimates of how much it would have cost to build the road, and then compared it to what was on the file, and found that roughly 24% of the road expenditure was missing. My colleague Asim and Atif got the record of all corporate lending in Pakistan, and they looked at politically connected loans, the idea that the loan goes not to the company that has the highest return, but to one that has the strongest political connections. And they estimated the cost of lending on the basis of political connections rather than anticipated return, and their estimates range between 0.3 to 1.9% of GDP cost for Pakistan. And the last one, by Enrico Moretti and Chiang Tai-she, looked at a very famous program, which is the Iraq's Oil for Food program during the period of sanctions, where they showed evidence there was systematic underpricing of oil, and this led to roughly the cost to Iraq, the Iraqi poor, of 2% of the oil revenues. So I'd say across the board, when we look at these estimates, carefully done estimates that try to use different ways of looking at corruption, we find that it matters, it seems to have a cost, but we should also note that the estimates are very varied. So in Uganda, 87% of the funds, in Pakistan, somewhere between 0.3 to 1.9% of GDP. So it's not so easy to say corruption matters, this is how much it costs. But I think as a result of it, in general, across the globe, you see a lot of interest in this question about thinking about, what should we do as policy? So this is not even thinking about growth, this is simply saying there's some amount of money that you want to give out as funds, you want it to reach the poor. It could be as Mark said, Bangladesh's policy of trying to provide education to the poor, what do you do to plug these leaks? And a very common response in the policy circles has been to say, we want to hold countries accountable. So I think the two main policy responses that you see across the globe, I'd say over the last couple of decades, the first was a strong push towards democratization. So many different governments, international donor agencies pushed very strongly to say we need to have local accountability, we need to have local governments, they must be associated with policy making. The second view, which I think is to some sense characterized by this cartoon, sort of says that, you know, how do you define foreign aid? Foreign aid is when you take money from the poor people in rich countries and give it to the rich people in poor countries. And I think this is a very common thought of how aid works. And in response to this, there's been increasing interest in thinking about aid conditionality. So the US, for instance, now under its Millennium Challenge account, says that the amount of funding you will get is conditional on your performance on 17 measures. And if you fall below a certain level on one of the measures, they will cut off all funding. A drastic example was with Mali. Mali had a coup, and the US cut off all its funding, including cutting off completion of one of the largest irrigation systems that would have covered a lot of Mali. It was 80% complete, but they said no more funding because you've done badly, we'll punish you. And I think this kind of policy response to corruption strongly presumes that, you know, there are bad guys. These bad guys need to be disciplined. And if we can, in some form, discipline these bad people, we will get countries to work. And it can either happen by using individuals within these countries through democratic mechanisms to achieve this kind of disciplining effect, or foreign governments should do it using their aid as the stick, the carrot, and the stick being you won't get it. But the problem with this approach is, again, if you go back to the data and you ask, what do we know about the link between using such incentives and corruption, the cross-country evidence is not very hopeful. So if you look at sort of just one example of a control of corruption index, which is the World Bank score, very widely used, is normalized at 0 for the median country. So being above 0 means you're below the median on corruption. Rich democracies as a group do very well. Poor non-democracies are the worst performers, but the difference between poor democracies and poor non-democracies is relatively small. So it really seems, if you look at this, it's really income, not the choice of the government's regime, that remains the primary predictor of growth. So you might say this is a snapshot. What happens if you look at change? So if you look at change, we again seem to find that what is a strong predictor of subsequent corruption outcomes tends to be GDP. So this is a graph from Vietnam, and it just shows you the time trend in growth across Vietnam provinces, and over time reports on enterprise surveys on bribes. And what you see is a very strong negative correlation that as growth has increased over Vietnam, you see declines in growth. And there's a very nice paper by Seema Jayachandran and co-authors that show that this link appears to be causal, that growth does appear to reduce corruption. On the other end, there have been recent sort of microfield experiments that have asked the question, does conditionality matter? So in Indonesia, Ben Olken and co-authors ran a study where they told Indonesian provinces that your future aid from a World Bank program will be conditional on your performance on educational and health indicators. They found no effect on education indicators and mixed evidence that there was some impact on health indicators. So governments did undertake activities to improve health, but this diminished very strongly over time. So even though in the policy circle you find quite a lot of emphasis on this idea of we need to increase accountability of these few bad guys, we find very limited evidence that this has been successful. So where do we go? What I want to talk about is, I think, a broader approach which many people have been thinking about recently, which says that you want to have a bit more of an iterative approach where for any given context you hypothesize about what the possible constraint is, you try to get some evidence on it, you then use some theory, some evidence to come up with a possible solution and test it out. It's of course, you know, a time-intensive effort, and it's not always generalizable, But I think, as Mark has already pointed out, that these very broad sweep, generalizable solutions are evidence, at least in the field of governance, is that they don't tend to achieve results. So, as I said, I think where we've seen quite a lot of progress recently in the area of governance is to broadly recognize it as what we would call a principal-agent problem. So to think about that, you have a delegation issue in governance. So there is either the citizens who are delegating governance to politicians, or it's politicians who are delegating service delivery to bureaucrats. The tools they have to control this delivery is either to monitor well and to provide incentives for good performance. However, for incentives to work, you need to have enough information about what the actual provider is doing. And much of, I think, the more promising evidence we've seen is in areas where we come up with ways of resolving this principal agent issue. The big constraint in some sense is that obviously in some settings the problem will be not providing the right incentives. In other cases it will be not having the right level of information. So if you go down this approach of saying that we want to think about political agency models, where we want to think about how to correctly delegate, you're going to immediately enter a world where there's very unlikely to be a one-size-fits-all solution. You're going to have to start thinking much more carefully about the environment, about the constraints. And at some level, this is a good way for economists to get a job, because a lot of what I think they can bring is thinking about these design issues, both from a theoretical perspective and then testing this out. So, since Mark has set the theme of talking mostly about South Asia, I'm going to continue it and focus even more specifically on India. And I want to just provide one example from some work I've done as a way of showing what this kind of design perspective could lead to. So there are many justifications one can give for work in India, but it is an interesting example of a country that has high growth rates. So it's had an average quarterly GDP growth of over 7% since 2000. But it also is both a very unequal country. So India, in this year's list, had 55 billionaires on the Forbes list. But at the same time, it was home to a third of the world's poor. It's had high industrial growth, but it also has extremely bad performance and pollution standards. I think China and India are competing for the bottom of the league on all environmental standards. It's the world's largest democracy, so it's been very successful at having a political system where elections are the primary source of choosing the policymakers. Yet, most estimates suggest high levels of corruption. Going back to one of these survey indicators that are used broadly, the Doing Business Index, it ranks 132 out of, I think, around 150 countries, so very low. So I want to focus in on one example of thinking about a design perspective, which is in the case of pollution. So as I said, China and India right now are very striking in terms of air pollution levels. I think I'd say 15 to 20 years ago, when I talked to someone who would go to India, the first thing they would notice was typically always just the sheer poverty, the people on the street. I think it's around now, I increasingly hear people who say, oh, I went to Delhi and I couldn't breathe the air. So in some sense, you see very bad air quality, increasingly a constraint across these fast-growing economies. And the problem is not an ability to pass regulation. Both China and India have very strong regulations against pollution on the books. India has completely copied the US Environmental Protection Agency approach in setting high standards. And there's one view that, well, the reason it doesn't work is because there's widespread corruption, that essentially these regulators are just totally corrupt and pocketing money. When I was to think of a solution to this, it's important, valuable to think of a solution to ask, what can you do that doesn't put in place another layer of monitoring that just worsens the problem? Equally, you do want to also start by asking, is that right? I mean, there is a lot of sense of first asking, is the biggest problem bribes, or is perhaps the problem that at some level the regulator doesn't even know where to start? So We worked in the state of Gujarat, so this is just an example of what the air around one of the industrial areas we worked in looks like. It's an interesting state in that it has the largest share of post-licensing reform in any state in India. It's also home to some of India's most polluted industrial clusters. I think one of its sites, we worked in Vapi, has its own Wikipedia page for being, I think, among the top 3 most polluted sites. And as I said, it's not because the regulator doesn't have an ability to act. They undertake frequent inspections, and they have very strong powers. They can close down an industry without needing to go to court. The first question you might ask is, does the regulator has the power to close down industry, but is it actually able to identify which industry to close down? So the system used to get information is very similar to, in some sense, what you would see in the financial sector in Wall Street, and one that we know led to a lot of problems, which is companies hire auditors that submit reports. So every company in Gujarat, which is above a certain size, is supposed to once a year file a report on its pollution outcomes. But these auditors are chosen and paid for by the firm they audit. You can immediately see why this leads to perverse incentives, especially in a system where there are a lot of people willing to act as auditors. You can go shopping for the auditor and cut a deal where the person puts your report as being in the clear. And from the perspective of the regulator, you now get a lot of information that you know is useless, but you don't know how to start changing it. So this is the context in which the regulator approached us. They recognized they had a problem. In fact, they had such a big problem that the industrialists had gone to the court saying that this scheme should be suspended because the information is never used. So the court had come back and told the regulator, you need to do something to make the scheme improve, and this is the point at which they wanted to know whether it's possible to change some features. So we went in not knowing whether the problem is high levels of corruption. So it could be that you're getting information but then just not willing to act on it, or is it that there is just a problem in the information they're getting? So with some co-authors, we sought to focus on one aspect, which is the conflict of interest. And so in a sample of firms, we changed the mechanism. So instead of you going and sort of shopping and getting an auditor, the regulator would assign the auditor to you, and then this auditor would be directly paid from a central pool. So you completely cut the financial incentives between the auditor and the plant that they are auditing. And then these auditors also face some likelihood that they will be monitored afterwards. So let me start by showing you what the status quo looked like in the system. So this is what it looked like in the status quo before any change. This is for one pollutant, suspended particulate matter, which from a health perspective is the one you care the most about. The red line is the regulatory standard. And you could look at this and say, if you were a Chicago economist, you would say this is how a policy is supposed to work. Basically, all firms realize that they need to just comply. Abatement is expensive, so they comply at exactly the right level. You could be cynical and you say, well, what this tells you about is complete regulatory capture, that the regulator sets the regulatory standard at exactly the level where everyone is. Or you could take a third view, that there is no truth-telling going on. So for all these firms, we also collected independent data on their pollution outcomes. And when you compare the two, so this bottom graph basically is the truth, you see that it doesn't look like there is either the Chicago view that firms did a great job with abatement or the regulatory capture view. Rather, what it looks like is just that there is no truth-telling. There is a lot of ticking the box and putting and saying you're just under the standard. So now we want to compare this system, which is the status quo, with what happened when we removed the conflict of interest. So what happened in the firms where we assigned them the auditor, and the auditor was now paid from a central pool. So this tells you the change in outcomes. So this basically tells you that when you look at this is the regulatory standard, basically comparing the change policy group to the status quo, this is the biggest place where data disappeared from. And data instead appeared here and here. So essentially what this shows is that in the, what we would call the treatment group, in the group that got the new new incentive scheme, we see a big change, and we basically see much more truth telling. Now, you could say that's fine, but what we care about is well-being. What we care about is pollution outcomes. You could have more truth telling, but maybe that's not enough. Maybe it's still the case that there is no action. So what was reassuring for us is we then went and measured the pollution outcomes across these industries roughly 2.5 years after this intervention had been put in place. And what we saw is it did seem like there was evidence that the regulator was seen as powerful enough that firms changed their abatement behavior in response to this. So when we look in the data, what we see, this is just for 3 different outcomes. The blue bar is the pollution outcome in the status quo. The green is the pollution outcome in the modified system, so the red is the difference. And across a series of outcomes, what we see is it seems like once the firm knew that there was going to be better information available about them, they changed their behavior. And when we look at where this change in behavior came, it seems to have come from the very big guys. So it seems to have come from the guys who are very heavily polluting. And it looks, when we talk to the regulator, I think it sounded like the reason for it was the regulator doesn't go after everyone. Everyone is over the standard. So to the extent that they go after people, they go after the worst, the most egregious polluters. And those are the ones who realize that they should undertake relatively big abatement investments. But I don't want to sort of tell you this story as a way of saying, you know, this is the way we can solve the problems of the world. There are many reasons why a scheme like this can over time get corrupted. There are many reasons why even the regulator with this information may not expand and put it in place. What I want to sort of argue is that looking at evidence in this way, what it does is it helps us actually understand where the problem is. And what this tells us in this particular case, one of the big constraints was information. At least at this level, it was not incentives for the regulator. Once you provided good information, the other aspects of the market worked. But there's no reason why this outcome is going to be the same outcome in several other settings. So I think I'd argue that if I was to think about sort of where next, it's clear that at some level, corruption has high costs for growth, and ensuring some kind of effective governance is very likely to be the most sustainable solution. But the solution is unlikely to come by trying to look for one-size-fits-all solutions. It's also unlikely to come from just undertaking evaluations of existing schemes. What I think we need much more of is trying to identify where the constraints are, and is to enter at the stage of providing evidence at the policy design stage. Not always necessarily because you want to design the policy after that, but because at least you want to identify where the constraints are. And in some sense, in the end, policymakers will probably make policies very fast. They will probably say the amount of time it takes researchers to come up with good evidence is too slow for what we want to do. But I think what the best we can do is actually try to provide rigorous evidence on what the constraints are, and some of it may or may not hopefully make it into the policy process. Otherwise, as Debraj will tell us, conflict will be the main other solution. Thank you.